Hello, welcome to today's webinar, Identity Verification for California Consumer Privacy Act Compliance. My name is Nathan Rowe. I'm the Chief Product Officer here at Evident and happy to be presenting this topic to you, especially around how identity verification intersects with this. So as we first take a step back and we think about where identity verification comes into play in CCPA, you're going to find it in a kind of a couple different aspects or considerations that have to be thought of. First is identity verification is required. The regulation clearly states that you can ask for a verified identity, and we feel strongly that from a consumer privacy standpoint, the right thing to do is request it. You want to make sure as you're handing over personal information of various degrees of sensitivity, that you're tying it back to the user who is the data subject that the data is about. You do have to consider that the verification request must be reasonable. So there's clearly a tie between the type of data you have about a consumer and your ability to give it back to them. And what assurance level, as we would describe it, like how confident do you need to be in the user's identity? And as you may or may not know, there's not kind of one level of certainty when you do remote digital identity verification. There's a pretty wide spectrum. But the nice thing is there is a pretty wide spectrum, so you can match up the appropriate measure towards the appropriate level of sensitivity that's needed. And then finally, must be done safely and securely. There's been plenty of examples over the past year or so of really poorly implemented identity verifications. Like, sure, I'll fulfill the request. First thing you have to do is email me a copy of your identity document. Email is not really considered secure, and it does not offer protection of the data while it's in transit for the individual that's sending it or for the recipient. There's kind of lots of places that information might get stolen. So a lot to think about as you want to consider this. But the nice thing is, as mentioned, CCPA does carve out the ability to go do an identity verification, and obviously from advancing the privacy, the spirit of what CCPA is supposed to do, it's just best practices to also do that. So when we think about this, CCPA is obviously new. Really just went into effect a couple weeks ago, and they've given guidance that the enforcement actions are not expected to happen until we get further down into kind of mid-year this year. But as we step back and we look at parallels and similarity with GDPR, there's actually quite a lot. GDPR has very similar requirements, has very similar carve-outs as far as identity verification before information can be presented. And what's really interesting is that this past year at Black Hat, there was a presentation about using the privacy laws to actually exfiltrate information from companies that held it. And this is what's really interesting as you start thinking about it. There are many different ways that you can go get access to information. And this is meant to be a very standard way, a very consumer-focused way, consumer-centric way, rather, that allows you and I as individuals that interact with businesses directly or indirectly to go get access to our data. The challenge and what really was proven is how you do that, how you implement a program, how you make that program scalable and secure is potentially a lot harder than it seems, because as always there's bad actors, and those bad actors use these things to go get access to data. So the net of it was there was an individual that used his fiance's information with her consent, but without her assistance, to go out and go effectively exfiltrate this data. They went to something about 150 different companies and was able to get many of those to respond to him. There's a handful that didn't respond, kind of works the whole spectrum, but at the end of the day, he got a lot of her data, and he shouldn't have. Yeah, obviously, he is not her. She wasn't helping, and it's not like he had kind of inside track. He basically had a little bit of her biographic information to go do that, and that was enough to get through. So I think what that really showed is that the ability for folks to go use these new things that are happening, these new regulations, and exploit them is obviously very high. And this was very early on in GDPR. It had barely been in effect a year when this was done. But I think we should also look at that as good learning experience and use it to make ourselves better as we think about things we can do as we look to be compliant with CCPA and again be very consumer centric, consumer focused. So as we look at privacy lawyers and class action lawsuits, we are certainly seeing statistics and trends and predictions about what's going to happen and what's going to evolve. And I think with any regulation, there ends up being enforcement action by the regulators, but we also see a lot of movement with just attorneys. And given that U.S. is much more of a litigious society than you see in some of the European areas, I think we're all safe to predict that this will be something where you're going to see litigation action happen and likely to be class action, because if a business is doing something wrong, they're likely impacting all of their users. This could be tens of thousands, if not tens of millions of individuals in many cases. So obviously the risk and the damage and the claims that could be made are going to be very, very significant there. So we look at this as, while not maybe the main motivator to go put in identity verification, certainly a benefit and another risk mitigation approach as you look to be compliant and then reduce some of the litigation risks that might result from a poorly implemented compliance program. So as we take a step back and we think about why identity verification matters, and IDV stands for identity verification, and in this context we think very specifically about it in terms of remote identity verification, which is connecting a physical individual that's coming in and interacting through a digital form, mobile or computer, and wanting to prove and assert that they are somebody that they claim to be. So I think you could easily sum this up as identity verification is connecting the physical with a digital presence that they might have. The digital presence is how you as a company interact with the consumer. So number one, avoid DOS attacks. There has been a bunch of talk around individuals using this as a way to cause a lot of work and cause a lot of noise to businesses, cause a lot of things to go just because of the pure volume, things to get dropped. Which is not good because now you're out of compliance. So, you do want to have the right process in place, to make sure that you're getting legitimate requests, they're being submitted, you have the right information to properly fulfill and process them. And then obviously the security associated with it, which gets us to our second point, which is vet the data subject request. So, if I show up and I claim to be Nathan and you have some sensitive information, you want high confidence that you believe that I'm Nathan. Which is really, really important. And in the same side, if you're not doing that, you effectively could be, making a data breach happen. So if I show up and I claim to be Sam, and I'm not, but I can get Sam's data, and Sam's data allows me to go impersonate Sam. Maybe I get password credentials, I get, other personal information out of it. It would give me the ability to go implement an attack. And do something that could be, very bad. So whether that's identity theft or identity impersonation, as I get this more sensitive data, as I learn more about your behavior, and your preferences and your trends, it certainly gives me much better ability to connect that with other data I'm able to learn on social media or the dark web, and probably very effectively claim to be you and implement an attack. So, really, identity verification matters much more broadly than just one of these consumer rights requests, but it certainly is very pertinent to that as well as we think about it. And I think what's really nice, and I give the regulators a lot of credit, as they thought through this, then they thought about some of these things, and they did put the provisions in to make it okay to go do this. Otherwise, we'd have if they had left it silent, we'd be in an okay spot. If they had left it, specifically that, hey, you can't do that, I think we'd be in we'd take a step back. Because effectively, you'd open a back door to go get access to, lots of consumer personal data. So there's a couple things to go over as we think about, like the industry thinking around this and different approaches. And argument number one is, don't use identity verification for data subject requests or consumer right requests. And the kind of the thought is scanning IDs is a privacy risk because you're asking for more PII from the requester, and they might be put off by it. Our answer to that is Well, you certainly don't need exposure to the PII, and you certainly don't need to store it. You need the confidence. And that nuance is actually really important. What you're looking for is the assurance that someone is who they claim they are. You're not looking to amass a greater wealth of PII about an individual before you expose information. So yes, it's true, and factually true, that you may be asking for personal information that you don't already have, but you may also have much more sensitive information than the pieces of data that you're asking for. You might have, information that you could consider on parity with the data that you're asking for as well. So the fact that a consumer can present evidence that they are who they claim to be, you can corroborate that evidence, ends up giving you a much stronger position to say, when I release this sensitive data, I know who I'm talking about. But we're fully aligned that you shouldn't necessarily have or store or persist additional personal information, by the requester. And we'll talk about this more. Obviously, it does need to be aligned. You cannot ask for an identity verification that's not well aligned with the data that you have about an individual. So, if all you know about is their email address and a little bit of usage on the website, that's going to be a different story than if they're coming in and you have information about shopping preferences or race, religion, any other data that you might not traditionally think is personal information that actually ends up being, in this day and age, extremely valuable personal type of information, right? And that's where obviously a consumer expectation has to be aligned as well. But there is a spectrum. We'll talk about a little bit more as we go through the presentation. Argument 2 against identity verification for data subject request or consumer right request. We can just ask knowledge-based verification questions, and I think most of us have seen these on a regular basis, and it's where have you lived in the past 10 years? What phone numbers have you ever been associated with? Type of questions. These things that have been around for a very long time, those continue to be out there. I think there's a couple things that have happened. We don't view that as being safe or secure. And primarily because the data associated with that has been breached, is out there, it's accessible, not even on the deep dark web, it's actually pretty accessible for the average person to go get access to, meaning that if you ask a question that you don't have intimate knowledge of or you're not the sole holder of, someone else might have that data and can then impersonate you and go through one of these identity theft attacks and get more data about you, and then you do more attacks. So, there's lots of weaknesses associated with that. But it's not just us, not just evidence saying this. NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, has come up and has actually effectively said knowledge-based verification, KBV, or KVA, is deprecated. Thou shalt no longer use it. And they've made recommendations to actively migrate from that. Now, obviously, they're an organization that's meant to get guidance to government organizations and agencies. But I think, over time, they do great work, especially in kind of these really meaty topics like identity verification, authentication, and there's kind of a lot to be learned from it. So really good research by some very credible individuals, that we know and that we've worked with before, that have put really good thinking into this. And I think it's something that we should model after. So, you may think, hey, this is the standard, this is the easy way, go about that. Typically, it's not secure. It's not going to give you the level of assurance that you really need, as you have more sensitive data out there. Manual requests are frustrating as well. Typically, especially if it's over our call center, it's not on a web page. You're asking someone a question about, something that they might not have in context. Was I associated with that address 10 years ago? Was that phone number associated with me, especially as we kind of remember phone numbers a lot less than we used to? That becomes harder. And there's kind of a lot there to consider about, just even the customer experience. What are people expecting these days? And what are we doing there? Plus, not to mention, as you're doing that, you're exposing the call center agent to a lot of personal data as well. So, you kind of run a little bit, bigger risk there, that you might have a, lower skilled employee that might be more motivated to, take some of this data and do something with it that ends up being problematic as well. So lots of reasons not to go down a KBV or KBA path. Just ends up the data is not that secure and not that meaningful. Argument number 3 against identity verification for data subject request or consumer right request. So we collect data. We already have a bunch of personal data. And we already know they have logins for it. So they're already logging into the system, and they'll just make a request once they've authenticated. Great. Yep. No question. Lots of businesses have that. Lots of folks have really good workflows around that, and lots of folks have really good mechanisms to secure those username and password. It doesn't change the fact that consumer behavior, well, no amount of talking or broadcasting this from the top of the mountain, gets it across, are not good hygiene with passwords, period. People reuse passwords all the time, typically across hundreds of internet properties. And what that means is that, well, your site might not have been hacked. It does not mean that someone else's site wasn't vulnerable, wasn't attacked, didn't have something bad happen. And now that same password and same email address combination that was good for site, A, B, C, D, through the next 100 is not vulnerable on your site. And it is, and it likely is. There's great services out there to help monitor that, to know if it's been hacked. There's great tools as password managers. But, the reality is we all know the general consumer doesn't think about that. They want it to be easy, and they use these kind of lower friction, 1 password, many sites, or 2 passwords, many sites to get through. And what that means is that as they show up, they, just because they have a username and password doesn't mean that they are who they say they are. So it's one thing to say, hey, I'm going to do something in the account. I'm going to, make an order, and the credit card is saved on file, and something's going to ship out, right? There's some limited loss. It's another thing to say, I'm going to go in and I'm going to export all my data. I'm going to issue a request. I'm going to go download all my data. At that point, you have a pretty significant problem because you're giving data away in places that you shouldn't. So, the fact that I found a, very, non-tech savvy, lightly protected website, and I was able to get a password out of it. Now I can come to, much more valuable property and use that same flow, is a reason that we should think about where identity verification fits. And this is a great example of escalated access, escalated privilege management, which is a very fancy, very enterprise way to say, I'm going to do something that's not the norm, that needs a higher level of verification. It can't just be kind of the standard you log in. I want a second factor. I want another verification to really make sure that you are who you say you are. So as I come in and as I do that, it may be great. Yeah, we'll save this request. Thanks for logging in. That's step 1. Step 2 is we need to go through an identity verification. We can make that quick and easy, not a big deal, but at least we have another point of cooperation that you not only have knowledge of an account, you email and password in most cases when it's consumer-based, but you also have evidence to prove that you are who you say you are. So now all of a sudden I'm taking from what is certainly better than just showing up and providing an email address, but not significantly better, because typically if I've secured a password, I'm probably logging into your email as well. But you can bring it to a much higher level of assurance to say, yeah, when I gave that data out, when I gave that sensitive personal information out, I gave it to the actual data subject. So I know that I'm not spreading information inappropriately across the internet. So kind of a big deal and a big net improvement kind of in a flow, and again, done in a way that is not perceived as adding a lot of friction, and build a lot of messaging around it to make sure that the consumers know it's being done for their benefit. It might feel a little bit off, but certainly done for their own protection. So then the other aspect to think about is, how do we automate this as we go into identity verification? Lots of different ways to do it, lots of different approaches that are out there, different levels of effectiveness. So it's not just what level of confidence or assurance I need, but how do I put things in place that I have confidence that I am engaging appropriately, and I'm doing it in a way that's fast. I'm doing it in a way that's automated. That's not causing me a bunch of administrative overhead and not exposing me to a whole bunch of additional information that I really don't want to see. I don't want exposure to, say you're taking a U.S. identity document like a driver's license. I don't want the driver's license number. I don't want anyone in my organization to be able to see or get that. So when you look at this, putting it in obviously helps you weed out, bad actors and bots and things like that, because they're not going to be able to launch an attack at scale. You get a better customer and user experience, right? Automation ends up making it quick and easy. So you think about putting these flows together where you can say, from the moment they submit their ID to a short while later, giving them a thumbs up, and in a user experience say, yep, great, your identity is verified. Here, give us another day or two, and you'll receive a secure link to go download your information. As you start thinking about those flows, you have a lot of ability to kind of build just a really positive interface. So there's a lot of good impression and goodwill that you start to form with your brand. And then the admin overhead. Obviously, we don't want to put something in place that's going to require a lot of manual review or people to make judgment decisions. Those are never good. We need to put the right rules and process in place that as you're processing this, you're thinking, this is what I'm making the decision. This is what qualifies as okay. This is what doesn't. Then maybe there's some small percentage that go to an escalation procedure, or you give the consumers a way to do a step up. Maybe they can't prove their identity via one method, and we choose a alternative method. But there's kind of lots of different ways to automate that, so it's not all of a sudden a new support headcount that you're having to bring in to operationalize this. So as we think about this, it is very simply bring it in, give you quality of confidence that you know who you're dealing with, and do it in an automated way. Make sure that those users coming in have what they need, are able to kind of get in and prove their identity, and you're not spending a lot of time and don't have a big backlog either with responding to those requests. So as we think about kind of stepping into this and thinking about how you might approach consumer rights requests, would start out with, number one, create your personas. And a lot of us, as having internet properties, we certainly do at Evident, have many, certainly not dozens, but it's probably more than one or two. You may have the website visitor. They probably need a slightly different approach than someone that would be more of a customer that has an account holder that you're going to have more data associated with, maybe even more closely tied to who they are. So you need to make sure as you approach this that you think about the different personas that are out there, the different types of users you have, so you can think about both assurance levels and how you route to fulfill the request. So when I think about our process here, it's one thing if someone shows up and we kind of determine their persona X, they're going to go to a set of team that's going to pull some potentially light information. If they're persona Y, they might go through a more in-depth identity verification, and then we'll go fulfill the request that they had. So it really starts to depend on kind of where they're coming, what relationship we've had with them, which ties very specifically to the type of data that you've got, the sensitivity of the personal information. Once that's done, verify identity. Again, tie this to the assurance level of the need, so you're kind of abiding by not providing excessive friction or barriers to get the request fulfilled. Make sure that's well aligned to the type of data that they've got. And then finally, share the data with the customer. Just caveat this: make sure it's through a secure channel. No need to broadcast what is potentially sensitive information over email, or something that's unauthenticated, unencrypted, type of link, especially given what likely is a large volume of data. As we think about some of these cases, they're not typically going to be short, concise, here's 4 data points I have on you. They might be quite extensive in this world of big data and personalization and all the things that we collect and gather to drive those engagements within our properties. So as we get a little bit closer to wrapping up, CCPA is here, as we mentioned, went into effect January 1st. The regulators have given guidance that the enforcement actions will start to happen mid-year. So, really not right to take a wait-and-see approach with data subject requests. We've heard from our engagements with customers and partners out there that they're starting to see an uptake. There's clearly a early adopter phase that's going on where people are going out, reaching and trying to start seeing how they go through this. And there's, learnings that are certainly happen, perfectly normal. But there's also a lot of guidance and support that we can provide here at Evident. So, feel free to reach out and we'll help, have a conversation with you, kind of understand what your needs are, what type of data you have, and, make the right recommendation. be proactive. I mean, don't let this where all of a sudden you've got, requests piling up for, access or deletion and you're not sure how to deal with it. Again, not that this is legal guidance, we'd never make that, but it does make a lot of sense to put a process in place. Obviously, as you go through it, you're going to learn, very natural motion. Put the process in place so you at least know what to do, who to contact, who owns it, what response time commitments that you're effectively making, and adjust as you start to go through it a couple of times. Like we probably all are starting to get some of those in and have, cases to practice. Don't let them go unanswered. That's not going to net out in a, in a positive way. Even if you don't know that you have a relationship with the individual, there should be something that makes that, confirmed in their mind that that's the case. And obviously, given that there's this little bit of rent period that exists, given how, long it took the regulation to be finalized, there is work that should be done now to, put on that path to getting to compliance. There's probably a sequence of steps to get there. So, start today. June is going to be here before we know it. Blink of the eye. We all know how busy things get in spring. So movement will be important. Great. And with that, we'll open it up to see if we've got any questions. There is a question window, so feel free to go in there and drop in questions, and we'll take them as we get them from the audience. Just caveat: sometimes there are a lot of questions, we don't always get to them, and if there are, we will follow up directly. Great. So one question, and I think this ties to a slide I had a few slides back. What are some examples of consumer right request personas? Yeah, and I think we could parallel this kind of very, very easily with some of the things that we've done here. So there are registered account holders and those without a registered account. So just quite simply, someone goes to your website, just your homepage. They click around for a little bit. You might put a cookie down after they've done the cookie consent. You know a little bit about them. You may or may not know their email address, but you've got something that you could tie to. And when they come back, you certainly could tie back to them. Then there's registered account holders. Are those that you've probably had deeper interactions with. They've gone well above and beyond the cookie consent. They've likely agreed to T's and C's of using your product or your service. And that almost naturally means that you'd have more data about them. Collecting whether it's engagement data, interaction data, things they've done, things you've put in place to offer personalized services. You're going to have different levels of data, and there's probably different systems as well. It's one thing to say, hey, you've been on the website, you kind of exist as maybe a not fully identified entity in the marketing systems versus, hey, like you're in the main product. You're a user. We know about you. We know your behaviors, some of your patterns. We know what you've bought historically. And obviously that's very dependent on the service or products that you offer. But there ends up definitely being a pretty good bifurcation of those. So I think those are black and white. As I mentioned, there's other ones as well. So you might have privacy lawyers reaching out. You might have contract workers, employees. There's different things to consider, just given the nature of the different systems that they're in. And it's really important to kind of know that as well. And there's also, as you think about it too, there's also needs to know that because of how that connects to other suppliers or vendors that you might have supporting you. So, whether it's in GDPR language, it would be a controller. You're kind of the main entity connection that you have with the consumer, but there might be processors, there might be others that handle the data that kind of sit behind the scenes that the consumers aren't aware of. You need to know these personas so you can properly route some of these consumer requests to these, what end up being subordinate entities that sit behind the scenes and help support your systems and tools. And having the right personas mapped out and defined naturally helps that. Certainly helps reduce administrative overhead. If you get a request in and you can quickly determine that they've only been on the website, very much simplifies the different systems that you should go check and the process that you've got to go do if it was a deletion request, for example. Lot simpler to have a narrow focus set of systems and assets that have to be checked and verified than it is to go check every single system in the process or in the stack. So as you think about having those personas, obviously that does get very specific to your business. But again, we would not expect that to be dozens. But it's probably going to be a handful or so. Great. Another question has come in. In what CRR scenarios is a higher level of assurance recommended? So I'm assuming I'm going to draw kind of a little bit of a connection here to this being associated with identity verification, given the topic of the webinar. But what we would say is that depending on the data that you have should guide the assurance level. So we can all kind of relate to, if I've just been on the website and I've clicked the cookie consent, but I've not given you any other information, you kind of know a little bit about the pages I visited, it would likely be inappropriate to go ask for a identity document-based identity verification. So, in that sense, you might want to do a quick verification that they've actually got access to the email, and you can go click and respond that. If it gets more sensitive, so they're on a property that's not just what websites what places you've been or what you visited, but you can start to infer religious preference, sexual orientation, things like that because of what you offer. All of a sudden now you have personal data. So that's probably a little bit more of a gray area, but at some point you pretty quickly get into where you do want to do a higher level of assurance of identity verification. Now, obviously, that ends up being different than you are a user or a customer. You have an account. You've given me a lot of personal information. I've done certain things to deliver services or a product to you with that information. And I end up having a longer-term relationship with you. The sensitive data might now get into financial information. The sensitive data might not get into medical information, health records, things like that. That obviously requires a much higher level of assurance as well. So as we think about kind of the spectrum that I've used before, it's good to think about identity verification assurance being on the lower end. Could be anything from I just verified an email address, right? Very, very low confidence. I might not even connect that to a real person, but at least I have some confidence that you have access or control of that email address. To on the higher end here in the U.S., where we get into a TSA pre-check, where you sit and you do an interview with a Customs and Border Patrol agent. They ask you questions, they take some biometrics, you're face-to-face, very high level of confidence there. There's lots of options in between those two. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I think this is thinking appropriately about what type of data you have, how sensitive is that data. And, the one thing that we often find as we get in these conversations with customers is the data is more sensitive than first appears, largely because of just some of those things that you can infer and, how smart the systems have been to get these inputs and then make those inferences, as well. So naturally, there's more of a slant these days towards needing a little bit more assurance than less, because of the sensitivity, and certainly nobody wants to be a poster child for giving out their customers' information. So again, as you think about the assurance and you think about the user experience with getting that identity verification done, it's always good practice to appropriately message the benefits of what you're doing, the reason why you're doing it. So the user, the consumer in this case, can clearly understand, here's what I'm being asked to do, here's why. Here's the sensitivity information that you're about to get. They can understand it's a big deal. They're going to participate in that, with you, versus looking at it and saying, hey, this isn't appropriate, or I don't want to give you this information. At least then they can make a more educated decision, and you can be, backed up on, we looked at this, we did the analysis, we feel that we have sensitive data, and because of that, we feel this is the right assurance level to ask for. And that could be, just to give you an example, it could be, a little bit of, biometric type information or knowledge-based verification. Obviously, that's more on the low end, like we talked about, largely deprecated, to getting to more of kind of newer methods, identity verification via a document that you have to submit. You have to take a picture of the front and back of your license. You can combine that with a selfie. You could do a mobile network operator to confirm it, right? So lots of different ways to go do that. Again, has to be very associated with the assurance level that you've got. There's really no kind of right or wrong answer once you start to get out to, out of that just basic website visitor that you really don't know much about. You might not even know their name outside of just you have a cookie on their device and you've seen where they've been. Great, just processing some of these. So another question that we have is, can I ask requesters to send me a copy of their ID as proof of identity? I've kind of hinted at this. I've not been overly direct, but certainly that is a technique that can be used to verify an identity. We typically want to think about this in terms of don't just email. There have been cases that we've seen where that was the approach. Email me a copy. There was actually, in the early days of GDPR, that was kind of like, I would say, the gold standard, quote unquote. We kind of, when we saw that, laughed at it. But like we mentioned at the start of the webinar, having someone just email you a copy of the document is not secure for lots of reasons, right? Not only because of in transit, but because once it gets on the other side, it's going to be stored, it's going to be backed up, it's going to probably be there forever. Those are systems that do get backed up on a regular basis, and having that data is, not really a great idea. Having that where other people can access it, maybe download it, is not a great idea. And not only that, but even if you got the document, you had all the protection, you're being exposed to a lot more than you really want. What all you really want to say is, hey, this is Nathan Rowe. Can you confirm that this document that he provided is associated with him? And that is effectively one of the core values that we provide, is the ability to return that data in that way. So you don't have to be exposed to the driver's license number, the date of birth, an address if you don't have it. All you're really getting is that confirmation. And a confidence level associated with it. So hey, I have what I need to proceed. If I needed to do an audit, I can, but it's securely managed and stored. So there ends up being kind of these alternative ways to do it with minimum disclosure of information, but getting that confidence and that business answer that you need to move forward. Next question we've got, and we're kind of getting close to wrapping up on time, so I might only take one more here. What if I have an authenticated access? So what if the user is a established account before making the CRR request? And this is this is a great question. We did cover it a little bit in the webinar slides, but I'll just go back to kind of recap what my comments on this previously. If all you're relying on is a password, and you're potentially giving someone the ability to download a lot more data than they've been able to get through your system before, you should really think about that as far as the impact that could have, assuming that someone has compromised that password. So, again, it just goes to kind of password hygiene, consumer behavior, what they do and they don't do. We know they don't use password managers. We know that they don't, typically respond or rotate passwords on a regular basis. They don't rotate passwords if there's been a breach, meaning that because the accounts are compromised, that it's likely that they would be able to use that account with your system. And that is like the core of the problem when we think about account takeover, right? There's lots of different tools out there to help protect against account takeover, but this pattern is very similar to any other workflow where we would think about escalated access. I am doing something that requires a second factor of authentication. And if you had two factors, that's great too. Do something else that you're going to have higher confidence associated with the user. SMS generally isn't great. So if there was another token that you had, or a soft token that might exist on a mobile device, or you could authenticate via a biometric, that's great. That's fantastic. Use the second factor that you're going to have high confidence in, to get into the system. If you don't, and obviously we know why those things don't always exist. Consumers also shy away from friction. So if it's easy to adopt and use, they do it. But typically that just doesn't happen. If you don't, that's where you want to be very cautious, and that's where you should consider should I put in this case, because of the sensitivity of data that I have and I'm about to return to the user, an escalated flow? Should I put in something where I'm asking them to verify their identity and have that as a way that now you have confidence that you know who they are? So, again, perfectly aligned with, CCPA and GDPR, again, should be associated with the sensitivity of the data that you have. So if you have that information that, typically isn't published on the website, that via this new process, this new, transparency that you have with your consumers could allow some of those, determination, again, not the traditional PII, name, date of birth, address, things like that, but you start thinking about, these other indicators that are, generally viewed as more sensitive: sexual orientation, religious beliefs, things like that. That's very, very valuable, very damaging type of information that could go out, if it was given to the wrong people. Financial information, obviously, health information, medical history, even some of these systems that are very closely monitoring, user behavior are starting to get to the ability to detect disease. And obviously it's not, you can't look at it and say, hey, that's what's going on, but the tools and the analytics that sit behind it to make those inferences are getting very, very good. The technology is democratized where it's very accessible as well. So it doesn't take a state actor anymore to kind of make those connections. There's a lot of work, both in academic, and then more nefarious reasons going on, to learn from that. So, I think it is something to consider, is that just, again, that sensitivity of data you have and how you connect that to where you might need an escalated privileged access, where you're going to do a second factor of authentication. And, in this case, because of it, you want that authentication to be someone being able to verify their identity, right? So very non-traditional, what we would think about as auth, right? User password, second factor, biometric auth. Those are all great. Those could fit into the mix, but, identity verification could absolutely be a peer to one of those other mechanisms and used in a flow where you stepped up. So with that, I know we're kind of running out of time. We had this scheduled for 45 minutes. Again, if there are more questions that come in, we will do our best to respond directly to them. I do want to thank everyone today. If you do have any follow-up questions or any other thoughts or want to engage in conversation, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to have those dialogues. Please reach out to us at evidenceid.com. And you'll find forms out there that you can submit a request to start the engagement. Happy to engage. So hope everyone enjoyed the webinar today. Have a great afternoon. And look forward to speaking to you next time.